Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest episode of the Adopt 365 podcast. Today, we're talking all about Microsoft Teams, and is your Microsoft Teams environment starting to feel like it's becoming a bit of a mess? What we've seen since the COVID period and the mass adoption of Teams is that Teams has become an important, pivotal part of the way that you communicate and collaborate in this hybrid working world that we are. But as things have changed, as things have organically grown, things are starting to get a little bit out of control, become a mess within many of our customers' environments. So, what we're going to do today with my co hosts, Megan Warren and Anthony Charman, is look into what you can do to bring Microsoft Teams back under control and make sure that it is serving you and your organization better. So, thank you, Megan and Anthony, for joining me today.
Yeah.
Hello.
So before we get started, the tradition on our podcast is just to go around and what is that one thing that stood out to you in Microsoft 365? So Megan, over to you first.
Mine is just a really simple new feature that ties in quite nicely to what we're talking about in part of today's podcast as well, which is if you're in a group chat in Teams, you can now put at everyone rather than having to tag everyone individually. Obviously, the question is if I'm sending it in chat, why am I tagging people? Obviously, just means that if they've got the group chat muted or have a lot of chats to go through, they'll get the notification in activity that they've been tagged in that as well. So, as I say, really simple, really quick, but really useful in the right scenarios as well.
Fantastic, really useful there. Anthony, what's yours?
So it seems almost a tradition that I get away with two things. So I've got two things this month. And that is really because I look after so many little bits of Teams, including Teams rooms and telephony. So there's always new stuff coming out. So the one that's really struck me this week, the first one I'm going to talk about is shared channels, just that ability to share channels with people outside of your organization. We've done this recently with a company who approached us saying we want to create a SharePoint site because we're doing a joint venture with another organization. Want to create a SharePoint site and manage the security and their access to that. And in discussing that with them, it suddenly struck me that shared channels was a good way to do that. So we've now put that to the test, and configured kind of the federation within AD between the two organizations, set up some teams that are shared between the two organizations and some channels that are shared. And it's working incredibly well because viewing the kind of information and the conversations that are having between the two organizations through the kind of the filter of Teams has put a nice secure environment in that we've not had to provide any additional training because it's just the Teams environments they've been working with already. So that's my number one. The other one's a very quick one, which is that I saw there's a new feature in Microsoft Teams telephony, which allows you to configure a handset so that the moment someone picks it up, it automatically just calls one number. So it's great for receptions and things like that. We've got a shared a reception, which is often unmanned within our organization. We can now put a Teams phone in there that the moment is picked up, can phone an individual or a group of people directly without anyone having to press any buttons on it. So yeah, great new functionality in telephony.
Fantastic. Really like that idea of the reception phone. I think that's something that people have been waiting for a long time. So my one thing is something that's really simple. And when I saw it and I was amazed by it and I showed Megan, yeah, she of course known about it for a long time. So when you're in a chat, when you're trying to find a piece of information, you can use the keyboard shortcut Control F to very quickly filter the search by that person, type what you want to look for and find what you're looking for that much easier. So for someone that uses Teams day in and day out to communicate, it was a revelation when I saw that, but clearly something I should have been listening to Megan's training a lot more when I found, because yeah, unfortunately I wasn't able to amaze her with that newfound information that I'd learned, because there's probably already a video on it on Adopt 365, our training platform. But no, it's all good. So that was my one thing. But yeah, not amazing to all.
I think we can all say as well this week we've all played quite heavily with avatars that seem to be in, is it public preview, so they're not generally available just yet. But we've all set up our avatars. They look as close to us as possible, I guess. I don't know that it it does look
I
like
think
me, but doesn't look that dissimilar. It's okay. I was quite disappointed that they didn't have one with a proper fringe that looks like my fringe at the moment. So Microsoft, if you could work on that. But um, and we've used them in a couple meetings. I'm still on the edge of potentially not a fan, but interesting to see them now in, and can still see how they will be useful to some people. But good to see them coming, because it's been quite a while that we've been waiting for those, I think.
I think it's very interesting to see people create them because you get to see what they think they look like, which is sometimes very different to what they actually look like. But yes, it's a really interesting view into the psychology of people.
Yeah, I think Megan and I are both wondering which one of us doesn't look like the way we think we look like now, based on Anthony's conversation. So now my two co-hosts have cheated and done two things for our one thing section of our podcast. Let's move on to the main part of the podcast, not the codcast. That'll be very different. So let's have a think about this then. So Microsoft Teams, pivotal to the way we're working during COVID. I think some people that were starting to look at it have seen it as the must-have way to work. Different organizations use it in different ways. Some have got it down that IT have to do everything, like creating teams. Maybe haven't even enabled chat. I've got to be honest, more often than not, we see it kind of in a hybrid mode. But whichever way, I think as time goes by, the once manicured Teams environment that you may have started with, and bear in mind that not everyone started at that manicured place. They started in a free-for-all in many organizations, is getting a little bit of a mess. It's becoming a little bit difficult to figure out, where should I communicate this? Where should I find that? What on earth's going on? I've got 120 unread actions, activities, notifications. It's all just getting a little bit out of control. So today we're going to go through some of our top tips to really get that under control. And we're starting with me, which my point is streamline your channels and teams. And this is the area that kind of, I think, gets out of control first. So what are some ways of doing that? And I hope everyone obviously knows teams are kind of the highest container where you're separating the different subject matter or teams, as in your departments, and other things, with the channels then sitting underneath, starting with the general channel and any other channels that you create. You can also have private channels that are locked down to just a subset of people inside that team. So the first recommendation I've got is to do a review of all of the teams and then channels in your organization. Understand what they are, who owns them, how they're being utilized. Are they indeed being used at all? Do they have an owner associated with them? Now, there are many fantastic tools out there that help you go and do the review. I think the tool Orchestry is something that we're going to be shouting out a lot during this podcast, but there are also some tools available to you today. So if you're less technically minded but have the ability to access the admin console, there's some great usage reports that are available. So in the Teams Admin Center, go to Analytics and Reporting, then go to Usage Reports, and then have a look for active users and last activity date next to all of your teams. I'd recommend exporting it into Excel, because then you can go through it, color code it, add a column to set activity, and as you're talking to the owners and the relevant people, you can go through that. And for most organizations, I'd imagine at least a quarter of those teams and channels actually are no longer needed, probably can be removed and simplified. Please make sure that you have a good backup before deleting anything, and check what's under the files section before you end up removing it for forevermore. But that's a really useful way to do it. If you're more technically minded, the PowerShell toolkit that is available will help you get a bit more information, add the owner onto that, find those teams that may be what's the word, be missing an owner, orphaned, is the subject that they say. My next point is, when looking through those teams, ask the question, could this really have been a channel? And I think we ask ourselves the same question when we go into a meeting and go, could this really have been an email, or could this really have been a telephone call? So go through there, and actually some places you've probably got a team created with all the associated SharePoint sites and channels, and it actually could just be a channel inside another team. And just a reminder, we at Computerworld, typically, we've standardized the types of teams that generally we recommend people create. The first being a home team, so it belongs to a specific department or a subset of people that come together for a specific reason. We then have a knowledge team where we're bringing together knowledge in a company to be shared with a group of people. And the third type of team is what we call a transient team. They come and go. They're not something that is permanent around like the previous two examples, or a project team or something that is associated with that. So think about those use cases and best suits. I don't know if either of you got any thoughts on those subjects that I mentioned there.
It's my kind of home territory, really, this, and one of my bugbears is just, I mean, there are two ways to approach your team's adoption. One is just let it happen, which seems to have been what most people have done, especially I think that was because Teams was forced upon us within COVID. The second approach, the other extreme, is to micromanage the whole thing. And I don't think either are the way to do it. I think we've all now got a lot of more experience with Teams, and we've all been forced into it. It is now the right time. That's really why we chose to do this subject for the podcast, to actually get it under control, actually wind it back a bit, tidy up that environment, because we now know how we're going to use this Teams environment for communication primarily and for collaboration. So yeah, I think that's what Barry said is a good time. It's a good time just to do that health check around the configuration. Keep an eye on things like external users versus guest users. A lot of us started off saying let's invite guest users in, but it might not be appropriate anymore, and there are issues around that. Make sure though you've not got hundreds of external users who you don't want in your environment, especially if you've got guest users. Go and tidy up that bit as well. But yeah, I think that it's just getting back to some standards and doing some standardization in an environment that you've maybe let grow organically and has grown out of control.
So Anthony, I think, sorry, go on, Megan.
I was just going to say I completely agree with all of that. I don't know that I have a lot to add without creeping in and stealing Anthony's thunder a little bit later, which I'm being nice because normally he steals my thunder, but I'll be nice today and leave that with him to talk about communications charters later. There you go. I stole a little bit of thunder there.
So Anthony, take us on to the next subject then, because I think it kind of connects with this very well.
Yeah, I mean, what I was going to talk about is just the importance of getting standardization in your teams and getting standardization in your naming conventions. I know that when we look at organizations' environments, we will find 101 themes that are called test or trial or things of that nature. We'll find ones with whole sentences as a name. It's important to get that naming convention set up in your organization so that you know what that team is for. And as Barry said, we have different types of teams. So, departmental teams, we would always have a suffix on those of either DEP- or DEPT-. Project teams, those transient ones that Barry was talking about, are also, we do PRO or PROJ, depending on who we're working with. And just have it so when you look at the name of the team, or when you're searching for the name of the team, it's very obvious to you what that team is for. There's, as Barry said, we'll be shouting out Orchestree quite a few times in this podcast. That's a great little environment and settings for managing your naming conventions for things. The next thing to think about is the length of the team name. As you'll see, if anyone's sat in front of Teams like I am, you get about 20 characters of the team's name on the left-hand sidebar without it going over the edge and just having to be extended into clicking on it to find out the full length of the team. So get a really salient name of a team up front in that in the name. Don't kind of do all of them as the team where we ... look after this, that, or the other. Make sure you've got it up front so you can see exactly what that team or channel is doing for you. And yeah, just create and publish some standards around that so that you're going to get a really, really coherent environment that people can find their way around easily.
I think some good tips there, and there are of course ways inside the Microsoft Teams admin console. I think it's more in actually Azure Active Directory that you're able to pre-configure the naming conventions. However, when Anthony or I we've ever looked at it, they're quite rigid and don't offer that flexibility. to give the classification around it. It's more around assigning it elements that might be in Azure Active Directory, like the name of the department that created it and things like that. So I think if you want to standardize that in a way that needs more control, something like Orchestra, where you can create kind of flows of the different types of teams and how those were named, probably gives you more of that freedom.
Yeah, you can also, again, a shout out to Orchestra. You can set up banned words, so a reserved word list for team names. So you can stop people putting the word test in, because it's just a great catch-all that everyone puts in. And you can make sure that they're putting something sensible in there. So really, really good to set those standards. And there's always this debate about who can create teams, because originally, the default setup for teams was that anyone could create a team, and that's what caused a lot of the chaos early on. We like to reduce it to a limited number of people who can create teams. And with products like Orchestra, you can then streamline the kind of workflow for creating a team. So you can then put some values in place which say, no team can be created with just one owner. They've got to have 2 or 3 owners. And it will pre-provision certain channels for different types of teams. So you get the Teams template, which I know is available within Microsoft, the Microsoft environment, but it doesn't really work that well. What you can do in Orchestra is define your team, put in which channels are going to be provisioned as standard in there, who the owners of that are going to be, or insist there are 2 or 3 owners, whether you're going to allow external users into that team or not. But then you can also, when people request that team, you can set an approval workflow, which means that it can go to the IT team or the HR team, or someone else who's going to actually approve that team can be created. It also allows you to manage the life cycle of that team by putting archive policies and things like that on it, so you ensure that they are being used. It also will allow you to see which teams have and haven't been used, which ones get used the most, and which ones have been not used at all. So yeah.
There we go. There's our little ad for Orchestra. If you'd like to see it in action, reach out to any of us, and I'm sure Anthony will be able to do that. So let's move on to the next section now, and I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball now, put Megan up to bat. Megan, could you, because you probably are better off at describing this than I, the next thing we want to talk about is files. Files end up absolutely everywhere in Microsoft 365. And the first element that I thought maybe you could lead us on is, where should your files be stored? So you've obviously got OneDrive, you've got Teams, you've got SharePoint. Get the conversation going, and I'll go from there.
Yeah, so when I'm talking to our clients and the users of our sort of the companies we work with, the 2 that I mainly focus on are OneDrive and Teams. Obviously, Teams is on SharePoint. They don't need to know that. As soon as you mention that, they try and start digging into it. So we'll forget that, and we'll just talk about OneDrive and Teams. The way I like to talk about it is OneDrive are for those files for you as an individual, one person, OneDrive. Obviously, you use it as your personal drive. It's where you save everything. The curveball there is you can share files via OneDrive. However, the recommendation is only to share files via OneDrive if it's an ad hoc document that you don't need a full team or project or channel around, or it's maybe somebody that you're just working on an ad hoc basis. So it's not a long-term relationship where you need to have that shared space. It's just this one document or this one project that you're working on, and you just need to share that with them. But OneDrive typically is for those documents that you're working on as an individual. Teams then is for those team documents. There's not a lot more to say. Obviously, you should have your appropriate departmental or project team with the relevant channels in there, and any document you're working on for project A needs to go into the channel in project A, team, etc., and should all be shared within there. And any team files, anything you're working on for a project department on a regular basis should be in that relevant location. Hopefully that was clear enough.
That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you for getting us started there. I think the only other element might be SharePoint by itself. And typically we see that with company-wide documents. You might have a repository of templates. You might have things like terms and conditions or other policy type documents that might be available. And commonly we see a team isn't associated with that. It's a communication site on SharePoint, and there are repositories with the relevant rules, etc., that might be in there. So I think the first thing is just consider, are your documents in the right place? We've seen companies where somebody has all the files in their OneDrive and has created links to share it with everyone else. We've seen lots of teams created with the files dispersed over it. We've seen everything in SharePoint. We've given our high-level recommendation there, but what is right for your organization will depend. One thing that I'd urge you to think about is, what is the life cycle of the team? Is it a permanent team or is it a transient team? And where do the files belong? So Megan quite rightly there mentioned that if you were doing project A, the files would be in the file section from there, and that is a good practice. But what you've got to think about is what happens at the end of that project. When that project is complete, what happens? Do the files get deleted? Are you okay with that? Do the files get published somewhere? Again, shout out to Orchestra. You could create a flow up. So when you got rid of the project, the files might be moved to an project archive team, and there might be a folder structure inside of there. You could also do something similar with some automation. I'll come to that a little bit later. So you've got to think about the life cycle. Where does it start? What happens in the project? And where does it end from there? Now, a couple of just best practices from my side is just use really descriptive names in any files you create. From my perspective, I don't worry too much about folder structures. I search for the files that I want to use. And by having a descriptive name, it makes your life so much easier to go and find those files again. So don't take for granted you know which team it's in, or you know which department it's for. There are some limits around file size and lengths, which I'm not going to get into. Don't make it too long. Don't make it a paragraph, but make it as descriptive as possible. Sales strategy for financial year end 2024. Presentation of sales strategy for the end of financial year 2024. Whatever that may be, you are doing yourself a favor when you're trying to find that later. And of course, as we've mentioned in this podcast a lot, use either office.com, the Office app, which has now been renamed as the Microsoft 365 app, to find those files and to be able to access them. So I think that's my general thoughts there around files. I don't know, Megan, Anthony, if there's anything else when it comes to files that we should be considering.
I think the only thing I would add is, obviously there are times, and this may muddy the water of what I just explained, but there are times that you start a document in OneDrive that is intended for a team purpose, but you're not ready to share it with the team, and you're currently working on it, and then you want to move it to the team when you're at a place that you're ready for feedback, you're ready to collaborate with people. I think there needs to be some structure around when I move it from my OneDrive to a team. Make sure that it's not just duplicated and my team are opening it up in the team and I'm opening it up in OneDrive, because then it's not the same document. I think there needs to be that understanding of, when it's moved into a team, that's the final version. You can almost get rid of it from OneDrive because that's where your team are going to be working. So I do think there is sometimes a little bit of confusion as to, when I move from OneDrive to Teams, can I still open it up in OneDrive, or do I then duplicate it? What do I do there? So I think that needs to be part of the discussion and the structure that you put in place as well.
That's such an important point, and that was the one I was going to make as well, is that it's all very well saying private stuff can go in your OneDrive, but then you get the kind of what I call the work in progress things, which are, you start working on something. I'll start working on a brochure or something, and I'll say to Megan, can you take a look at this? So I'll share it with OneDrive. It then never gets moved across into our Microsoft Value Proposition team and to the files area there, because we just forget. It's just so important that I think where possible, you should start it in the team and not put it in your OneDrive. And we've had a couple of instances with clients recently where someone who owned the OneDrive has left the company, or if they've had quite an aggressive retention policy on it, then things have been deleted from OneDrive that were really important. We can always go back and get things from OneDrive after people have left the organization, but it's better for them to have gone in the right place to start with. So yeah, it's a bit of an issue, But yeah, get the thought in place that you probably should be creating it in a team, even if you're not 100% sure that you want to share it with people yet.
Get it documented. I think it's important. I think from a OneDrive perspective, I assume that anything in OneDrive isn't owned by the company. So if your job is to create resources for the company, to share it with the company, until you've put it somewhere that is accessible by the company, you've not completed that job.
I think also, whilst we're talking about OneDrive, whilst it's not about the Teams environment, just a little reminder to people, if you are sharing things via OneDrive, just remember to go back in 3 months' time and do a quick check as to what you've got shared, and maybe retract some of that sharing capability, or if you haven't set deadlines on it, just revoke that access, because it is good practice. You don't want everything shared with anyone just ongoing if they don't need to access it anymore. So just do a little bit of a cleanse every now and then of your own OneDrive.
Seem to remember in OneDrive there might be a functionality to review under a single view your permissions on all your documents, isn't there?
Yeah, OneDrive Online, you can go and see that, and it's easy to revoke access on that screen quite quickly.
Fantastic. Well, under the subject of managing permissions, Anthony, over to you.
Yeah, I think this is one that is quite a difficult one to cover. What we don't seem to be in a habit of doing, in the old days, we would kind of design a storage structure, and we would decide what was going where, and we'd create the appropriate folders and move things into the right areas. In Teams, it's a little bit of a free-for-all. So we end up with a public team that's shared with everyone in the organization, and within the files area, we've just started creating some documents, and we've never gone back and thought through the architecture of our Teams environment. So we have two things within Teams that we can control access to things. We can create public or private teams. So public teams, not everyone gets told about them, but if they go and say they want, hit that I want to join a team button in Teams, then they can see all of those teams and they can request access to join those teams. But also we've got private teams which no one else sees, and only the people who've been invited by the owners can look at the information in those. So we need to work with that alongside we've got public channels and private channels. So we've already got kind of two layers of security before we start looking any further into that, where we can actually go into the manager teams option and look at the permissions that we set there under the settings tab, I think it is, where we can set things that, as read only, or people can upload them, etc. So there's always lots of different levels of granularity in the security that we can apply to things, but we tend to not think about that when we start setting up a Teams environment. So I think it's a good idea to go back and review the settings that we've got, because whenever there's kind of confusion, there's an opportunity for security to be breached. And I don't know, it's probably a good idea just to go back and pop in the search box, which is very good at finding things that you're not meant to see, popping in some things and seeing whether you're getting the right results and whether you're getting the results that people around you expect the colleagues to get as well. And if not, go back and lock things down. I think it's just as a Teams review is well in order at this point. A team security review is really, really important for us to go through and think about how we've configured things in the past based on the new kind of usage and the way in which we're using things.
I think it is important. I think there's, as you said, there are many facets to permissions and security, even down to document being shared. So you might have a team that is obviously completely locked down to one department, but an individual document in that team could be open to everyone in the company. So it is important to look at those things, probably from an IT administrator's perspective, make sure that you have the relevant tools in place to be able to review those permissions effectively. And there are some ways of doing that in Azure Active Directory. I think it's only available in P2 or other third-party tools. And I think we've given enough plug to one of our favorites, so I'm not going to mention the name anymore. But there is a trend that is being seen where people potentially leaving a company under bad circumstance might be adding their own private email address as something that can access documents, files, forwarding emails, access Teams, etc. So having those controls in place to understand when that happens will be very important. We've got a service called CWCare Secure for Microsoft 365 that takes that into consideration, where you can look at some of those things from that perspective.
I think also guest users. When we first set out for lots of people setting Teams environments, or people did that themselves, there was this constant question coming into me, which was like, what's the difference between a guest user and an external user? And it wasn't that clear at the time, but now we may find, as part of a review, that people have have guest users who have still got access to Teams that it's inappropriate for them to have access to. So it's good to do an audit of the guest users within your environment.
Definitely. So yeah, really important elements there. I think the context of security has changed a lot over the last 3 to 4 or 5 years. Your file server used to be probably the place where all your files were, that IT could quite easily manage where things were secure, but the users are having to have a lot more involvement in security these days, or if not, at least IT need to reconfigure the way that security works in the organization. So Megan, we're coming over to you now for tags and filters.
Yeah, so I think the key one that I want to talk about here is tagging, and it's something that is a fundamental of what people should be using in Teams, depending on where you're using it, how you want, or who you want to notify, etc. But tagging comes into the sort of Teams element and the chat element. Obviously, I spoke earlier around you can now put at everyone in a chat, but the key thing around it is making sure you are tagging people, whether that's at team, at channel, or at individuals, to make sure they're getting the notification. There's a fine line between tagging at team in everything so that everyone gets the notification so nobody misses it, or making sure that or people not tagging anybody and people missing it and being like, well, where was that information, and then resorting back to email. So all I'd say is just make sure you understand what at team, at channel, and at individuals is, when is the right time to use it. But you can also take that a step further with using tags in Teams. So if you're a team owner, you can go into the settings of your team and set up specific tags which allow you to categorize the people in the team depending on certain criteria. So maybe based on their role or based on location. So for this example, in our sales team, we have salespeople, marketing people, pre-sales people. Not every announcement I do on there or message I put on there needs to tag pre-sales in there. They don't need to know, but as default, if I put at channel, they would be notified. So what I've done is I've gone and set up a tag that is sales team, only got the account managers and the internal account managers on there, and now when I tag them, the right people are getting that notification. So making sure you have the balance of tagging in the right people at the right time so they get the notifications without bombarding them. The other part of that then is finding relevant information around search, and you're able to use filters in search, you're able to use filters in chat, whether it's for unread messages, for meetings, by someone's name, and then of course in activity by mention, unread, replies, or anything like that. So making sure you're giving the notifications and then also making sure you're finding your information as quick and as easy as possible.
I think potentially if people are using things like all company teams, which might be an option for those that aren't using Viva Engage or Yammer as it was once known, those setting up the tags for the relevant groups of people in there is probably really, really important. And as you said, sort of those wider teams that have quite a few people where you need to have a way of having those subsets of people inside of it.
Yeah, and I think tags in Teams is a very underutilized feature when I speak to our clients. It's something that people either don't know is there or they've seen it but don't really know how to use it. I think actually understanding the use case of it and how it could help you would be really useful. So it's definitely underutilized and one that's very easy to set up but has quite a big impact as well.
I think even from some recent training that Megan and I have done, even just at mentions, people haven't really come across those as part of an organic kind of learning of teams. And when you say, look, you can do this, they're like, oh, didn't realize that. I've been using it for a couple of years now and didn't realize that's a really good way to create notifications for people. So yeah, there's a lot of things that, because if people haven't had some kind of formal training, or formal sounds a bit too formal for that, but haven't had some training, they just have missed really easy things that they should be using on a daily basis that they're not. So yeah, it's really important to get that bit in place.
And there's Anthony just stole my thunder for my next point.
That's the way we play, isn't it?
I'm sure we'll dig into it a bit more. So Anthony, on to your next bit about communication habits.
Yeah, I think, sorry, Megs, I didn't really mean to steal it. I was looking very carefully whether you were going to talk about that later. But yeah, communications. I always start with this little spiel, which kind of goes for the last 25 years. The only way in which we had to communicate within an organisation internally and with people externally was email. And now we end up in a scenario where we can do internal, external chat. We've got conversations going on within the Teams environment. We've got things like Viva Engage, where we can do organisational-wide communication. And we've got numerous other ways in which we can communicate. And it's just really, really important to decide within your organisation how you're going to use those different channels. And that's where we come, we talk about creating a communications charter, which is really a framework which we can train to people on what's the appropriate thing to be communicated in what way. It's really matching the technologies to the type of communication that you're having or is available to you within Teams. It's just so important. I think it just makes the whole environment work very, very effectively. So yeah, chat and things like that. We tend to not encourage too many group chats because probably they should be happening within a team. A group of people within an organisation should probably be represented in a team. So we're not very much into big group chats, although we have a few ourselves, which are really, really useful. But they, think about what should happen within a chat, what should happen within a team, and what should be communicated elsewhere. And always the starting point for this, when I sit down with an organisation and talk through it, is to look in their inbox and see what's in the inbox that really shouldn't be there, that could be more effectively communicated in a different way. It's because our inbox has become kind of a mishmash of all kinds of communication, whether it be internal communication, whether it be personal conversations between individuals, or whether it be external organisations trying to market to us. It all just ends up in the inbox if we're not careful. So it's a good place to start to try and say what should come out of that and come into our organisational collaboration environment, and what should really be happening in the inbox. And yeah, it's a really good exercise to go through just to review that and then come up with a bit of a plan. We often represent it as a flow chart, just to say, look, this type of information here should go, oh yeah, it should be a chat, or it should be posted in a specific team or channel.
I think it's good to ensure that clarity is there, and it's what is your way of using Microsoft Teams. Microsoft Teams is used by many different organizations, and your organization needs to ensure that when someone joins your business or someone that's in your business, that it's very clear how your organization is making use of those tools in that toolbox. Anyone got any final points on that before we move on? So we're back to me then, you lucky people. We're now talking about automation of workflows. And this isn't something I'm going to dig into too deep, because I think it's something we're considering for a future podcast. But what we've mentioned across a number of things here is about life cycle, about what happens when a team is created and when it is destroyed at the end of it. And there'll be other life cycles, such as communication life cycles. When something comes into the business, where does it then need to go? And there's a great set of tools inside Microsoft 365 under the Power Platform, and specifically Power Automate, that can be used to automate things inside Microsoft 365 and beyond. And what you can do with Microsoft Teams is build workflows that help you manage that lifecycle. So we've done some fantastic projects for customers where we have automated the creation of teams, preloading it with templates that can be used, for example, with a project team, setting a process and then check if that team is still required, and then managing the archival process at the end. Of course, you can use other third-party tools. I am going to mention it again, Orchestrate, to do other similar things like that. So have a look at how you can make this easy. Make sure that people don't have to remember to go and tidy up and delete their teams at the end of it. Make it part of the workflow that is used inside your business. So I think we're now down to the final point now. Leaving the best to last, Megan, do you want to talk to us about training, support, and really getting the people involved with Microsoft 365?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the key thing to mention here is, even if you've done training with your organisation, it's always worth revisiting that, whether that's because you've got new people who don't know the way that your company work, or people will have forgotten things. I think it's really good to bring everybody back to basics, back to that standardization of everyone should be at the same level, at least this sort of foundational level of how we use Teams, because at that point everyone's using it in the same way. There's harmony around how people are using it. There's not some people doing it in Teams and channels and then some people doing it in email and chat. Bringing everybody back to the basics is always good, and there will be things that have been introduced in the last 2+ years that people won't already know about, or there will be things around the basics that they've forgotten or they didn't know from the beginning. So I think that's a key thing around bringing back to basics. I think another thing is just teach people what they need to know. Don't teach everybody absolutely everything if they're not going to need to know it. Just show them what they need to know, bring them up to the basics, and then that's the information they need. Don't try and bombard them with every training course on every Microsoft 365 application, because it's just too much. There's too many features, too much to learn. And I think the key thing around the consistency of features comes back to what Anthony was saying around communications charters, or a charter around when to create a team or a channel or where to store files. Make sure that everybody is using Teams and the applications in the same way, because at that point you'll then avoid the duplication of files or duplication of teams being created because somebody wasn't 100% sure if there was already one created, etc. So I think the key bit is revisiting training, delivering training, and making sure that people also have the ability to find what's latest on the with Teams. So if you have done the training, in 2 months' time, it's probably slightly out of date because there's so many new features in Teams. Making sure you have a platform in place that people can keep up to date with those new features. Teach themselves, not just wait for your training. They have that on demand should they need it.
For me, I think the most important thing about training around something like Microsoft 365 is it's not about Microsoft 365, it's about your users, it's about their job and what they do. Wholeheartedly recommend making it engaging, making it fun. Have a fantastic Microsoft certified trainer like Megan that is going to make it a lot more engaging for your organization. Don't make it dull and boring. This has got to be something that resonates with people. Don't lock them in classrooms, make it bite-sized. So to echo all those things that Megan has mentioned there. Anthony, you're heavily involved with that training adoption. Any kind of things that you've seen particularly successful?
I think the way in which we do it as a kind of a webinar, probably hour and a half, something like that, and breaking training into 2 phases, I think is really important. The first thing I would say is that we've done some training recently, and the users, I wouldn't say they were reluctant, but they were kind of thinking in their head, I don't really need to know this. I've been using Teams for 2 years now. I'm not going to learn anything. The feedback from that session was phenomenal, in that there were so many things that would have made their lives easier that they just didn't know because they'd learnt it themselves. And the fact that the training was delivered to all of the users in that organization within a short time meant that everyone's skill levels were leveled up, and they were all taught in the same way. And we would always talk to an organisation before we deliver some training to make sure that we're delivering the training that they require. And I think that's important. Even, just setting up a meeting in Teams, and the confusion between the Outlook calendar and the Teams calendar, the use of, of chat, people not realizing that you can hit the format message button, the little A with a pencil, and create quite a nice message rather than just a single liner, which was what people are used to and very happy with it within a WhatsApp environment. You need more than that in a Teams environment, and people are just gobsmacked when you show them something as simple as that. So yeah, I think that's really important. I said we should break the training into 2 phases, and I think probably the adoption of 365 should be in 2 different phases at least. One is the communication piece, and then the second bit is the collaboration piece, which gets a little bit more complicated and does need some more training, and that often needs to be done at a departmental level. So we can't deliver the same training across all of the people within an organisation. Different departments want to configure different tabs and different storage, so we deliver that separately. But no, I think we're really getting there now, and I think training is the key to people really adopting Teams and really getting some benefits out of it for their organisations.
Definitely. No, fantastic content today, both of you. I think this is a really important subject, and I think it's exactly the point where a lot of organizations are getting with Microsoft 365. I suggest start by talking to your users. A lot of the IT people that I talk to think everything's good, everyone's happy, everyone knows how to do it. We don't need to do training. People are already using Teams. You scratch the surface and you start to find these problems very quickly. Megan, any final thoughts before we wrap up the podcast?
I don't think so. No, I think that's quite a long list, though. We probably need to just recap what they are. And I would say if you are looking to do some of these, maybe pick the top 3 to begin with. I wouldn't try and go ahead and do like all 8 straight away. I'd probably say pick the top 3 that are going to make the biggest difference to your organisation and do those, then tackle the other ones after that is probably my one piece of advice.
So let's do as you suggest there, Megan. So let's just go through what the 8 were. So the first is streamline your channels and teams, do a review, think what's needed, and make sure you get it right. Probably as part of that, set up a naming convention for anything that you're creating to make it easier to find what it is that you're looking for. Keep your files organized, making sure that the people in your organization know where to save things, when to use OneDrive, Teams, SharePoint, and make sure that you're using things like descriptive names. Manage the permissions across Teams, your documents, and other areas. Make sure you're doing regular reviews. Make sure you know when guest users, those external users, might have access to your data, and maybe who else is accessing your data, and is it still relevant? Use the relevant tools that are available to you to help you with that. Use the tags and filters to help direct the conversation to where you want it to, and then to go and find it. And then make sure you're fostering those good communication habits where you've set the standards across the organization as to how people should communicate, and that people are always aware and kept up to speed with that. Automate the different workflows inside Microsoft 365 using Power Automate. And then finally, and arguably most importantly, make sure people know how to use it. Make sure that they are able to make the most out of it, know what your standards are, and really be successful in Microsoft 365. So Anthony, to you, I think you've got one final point, and then we'll wrap up the podcast.
Yeah, I just wanted to expand really on the security piece. Many of you, especially if you've got the business premium licenses or E3 licenses, will have access to some of Microsoft's security functionality. So the data around data compliance, around data loss protection, the purview information protection piece, and document retention policies. Do look at those. You're paying for them already. It's well worth looking at. Securing data in the Microsoft 365 environment is very, very different to securing it in the old style on-premises environment where we could, put a firewall in place and put some perimeter security in place to protect that and lock the door on the servers in the evening. So it's a slight paradigm shift into how we secure things within the Microsoft 365 environment, because we don't know where it's stored. It's not all of that information doesn't pass through our organization all the time. But yeah, just worth exploring what is there. And if you need any help, then do give us a shout, and we can help you through that process.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Anthony. So thank you everyone that has listened to this podcast or indeed watched it. If you're not already subscribed, make sure you subscribe, give it a like, and remember to ring the bell. Apparently that's what these YouTubers say, so you're notified when new episodes come out. Remember, the Adopt 365 podcast is brought to you by the specialists at Computer World. We're Microsoft Modern Working and Infrastructure Modernization specialists. So if we can help you and your organization get more out of the technology that you're using around the Microsoft Cloud, please get in touch. But for now, thank you ever so much for listening to this episode. We look forward to talking to you in the next episode of the Adopt 365 podcast.